Bro, y'all think growing up black and being an anime fan was hard, bro? Try growing up, being black, and listening to metal. When I tell y'all I got bullied, especially in middle school.
You know, being a black goth in the South is kind of funny because people either say you're satanic or you're gay. Never in between. Actually, no, there might be in between. Oh, you wearing black nail polish, you wearing all that stuff because you're gay.
You can't resist the snow bunnies? 1,000 lashes and your melanin has been snatched. You have now been completely dismissed from the African race. We hope Caucasian nation will accept you as one of their own. Because you're...
Man, here y'all go again talking about that's that white people shit. Why can't a nigga just be what a nigga is, huh? Y'all never heard of Bad Brains or Death? Them niggas made punk, come on.
I hope people can relate to this, because, man, that was hard growing up.
I have a very fond memory of being 12 years old and walking home from school with my CD player and my headphones on. It was the early 2000s, hence the headphones, and I was blasting Slipknot's Iowa album. You know, just minding my own business. Now, mind you, I grew up in Baltimore City.
Top of the fucking morning, dummy.
And I run into a childhood friend of mine who I've known since we were like 5 years old. We still cool today. We were from the same friend group in the same neighborhood. And he asked me a question that I always dreaded.
What are you listening to?
Doesn't sound like something crazy, right? But 12-year-old me, I immediately tell him I'm listening to Ja Rule. Because you know, Ja Rule and Slipknot, like, basically the same thing. And then he hits me with the follow-up question that always made my stomach drop.
Can I listen?
Absolutely not. You know what Ja Rule sounds like?
Baby girl, I love you.
And he didn't like this answer. We used to pick on each other all the time. So of course, he immediately grabs my headphones and he puts one of the speakers up to his ear, and I freeze. I'm completely mortified, y'all. And I know all of this must sound super silly and stupid as shit, but just let me explain. I grew up in an all-black neighborhood in Baltimore City and went to mostly black schools up until I went to college. And this was from the 90s to about the mid-2000s. You didn't really see black goths, punks, or metalheads just existing, walking down the street or down the school hallways. And if you did, they were immediately clowned. Maybe it was different for some of y'all watching this, but for me personally, no, clowned instantly, especially in elementary, middle school. So I learned very early to keep this part of my musical taste to myself. And the funny thing is that I liked all of the music that my friends listened to as well. I listened to hip hop, I listened to R&B, I even listened to that old folks music. That's what I grew up on with my mom. I knew every word to Get Rich or Die Trying. That was literally like the album during one year amongst me and my friends. And I played the writings on the wall on repeat. But in my house, I was exposed to music across many genres. One minute, my parents would be blasting Depeche Mode, the next Kirk Franklin, Black Sabbath, even some of that Al Green shit. It felt normal, but a lot of the kids I grew up with, they weren't listening to Black Sabbath and 50 Cent at the same time. It wasn't until I entered high school that I would encounter other black kids who were into some form of counterculture interest and aesthetics. And even then, it was a very, very small group of us. And then as I got older, I started seeking other people with similar interests who were in the same subculture as myself, which honestly, looking back, I don't know what that was. I'm gonna throw up a picture right here for y'all. I don't know what this was, okay? I don't know if it was goth. I don't know if it was, I don't know. But in my pursuit of looking and searching for like-minded people, similar interests, I found myself in white spaces. And it wasn't much better in those spaces. If anything, it was much worse. Bro, I still have PTSD from this one asshole asking me to name 3 Metallica songs because I was wearing a Metallica shirt.
Be nice. I'm finding it.
And then I remember this one time I was at this party and this white girl straight up said to me, "You're pretty cool for being a nigga." And looking back, I realized that these experiences weren't random. They were engineered years ago. It was the result of a much longer history that determined very deliberately what black people were supposed to sound like, look like, and be interested in. And yes, the obvious reason, racism, it always ties back to racism. But I want to go deeper than that in this video. I want to peel this whole hypocritical social structure back layer by layer like an onion to examine exactly why it happened and how it happened. Because black people didn't just stumble into alternative space spaces. They were there from the beginning, and this video is about that history, where Black people actually sit in the origins of alternative culture. Real quick before I dive into this topic, I want to give a special shout out to Fat Charlie. Fat Charlie is my co-collaborator for this video. This video is one of a two-part kind of like take on this topic, and to get the second part, you'll have to go over to Fat Charlie's channel. So definitely pivot over to Fat Charlie after you finish this video to get the more modern take of this topic. Even though my little story happened in the 90s and the mid 2000s, this is very much so still a thing today. Scroll long enough on any social media platform and you'll find a video of a Black goth girl or a Black metalhead just living their best life, and the comment section turns into a dumpster fire. Suddenly everyone's an expert, and the person in the video is being asked to validate their credentials to exist in this space. Don't even get me started on the anime cosplay community. To me, they go hand in hand.
The queer and Black impact on art cannot be understated. It can be commodified and regurgitated onto ugly ass tote bags and fridge magnets, but it can't be understated. Before punk or goth aesthetics, before disco and key bumps, there was the blues aesthetic. There was a bunch of other stuff, but we need to start somewhere. And using terms like alt, goth, or in this case blues aesthetic can only be properly understood through proper cultural context. The blues aesthetic is one aspect of the overall African American aesthetic. This seems obvious because the blues is one vector expressing the material, historical, and psychological source. Culture is a result of a common psychological development. But the common psychological development is based on experiencing common material conditions which are defined ultimately politically and economically. This assertion is critical to understanding that the best way to move style forward is with contributions from everyone. When I went digging for references for this section, I came across an article titled Aaliyah Core, the Black Alt Resurgence. The article is in reference to a digital creator on TikTok with the handle Aaliyah's Interludes. She's an alternative fashion creator combining all these styles from across different genres. She's gained a massive following for dynamic modeling and fashion content. Her viral style has encapsulated alternative cyberpunk grunge with rhinestone belts, demonia platform boots, fuzzy leg warmers, and miniskirts. She has also incorporated fashion across cultures such as Japanese Harajuku street style through vibrant pink and anime-inspired clothing. And what's fascinating is I read Aaliyah Core, and while I was wrong, I was still on the right track. Now, I'm an old person, so this is who I thought of when I saw the article. But do you see what I mean? This is late and great R&B diva Aaliyah, who passed around 2001, but I want to show you something. This is her at various points in the late 90s. I want you to pay attention to the style. Now tell me that this style doesn't pave way for this, but Black women dressed like this can find themselves being harassed for daring to dress in a way that's counter to what someone anticipates from a person of color. The problem with the erasure is that it creates a myth that Black alt people are new or posers. We simply want the world to understand that we have always been here, and that yes, some staples come specifically from us. We are the blues. This was our aesthetic. It historically carries all the qualities that characterize the African American experience. It is style and form, but it's the continuum of content. The idea is the feeling, the articulation that is critical, as well as the how of the form. Yet form and content are expressions of each other. This beaten black and blue aesthetic is intrinsically a staple of Blackness, but equally as important is understanding that we've been creating alongside you in alternative spaces the entire time. I'm not here to police anyone's entry into a space, it's how we got here to begin with. The problem with policing authenticity is that it can be challenging to sort between what is a sincere attempt at protecting a cultural practice and what's a jaded attempt at virtue signaling or control. I'm guilty of it myself. I watch a lot of travel content, but I don't watch cultural or lifestyle videos from white expats. I don't need a giant white guy to teach me about local Japanese customs. Is there some validity in my argument? Of course. Someone who isn't fully formed in a culture by virtue of growing up somewhere else is going to have additional biases built into their perspective. But does that make me sound like an asshole? Yes. Yes, it does. I've avoided using the dreaded R word that makes so many of you clutch your pearls, but when it comes to policing authenticity, a lot of it is racist. It's also reinforced by systems of conformity that use uniform rules or aesthetics to maintain control, but only got time for the racist bit. For the rest, I'm more than confident in your ability to parse together yourself. I mean, realistically they're one and the same, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. Even when black faces are accepted, blackness isn't. Political statements are read as disruptive rather than expressive when similar statements from a white comrade may be celebrated. The difference is that boogeymen are word again. White communities are terrified of discussions of race because they've never been incentivized to do so. And God forbid you be femme or queer. I've mentioned in my previous videos that most of the people that will verbalize disdain or harass someone will only do so with a soft target. A soft target are those that an aggressor believes to be easy pickings. You know, it's predator logic or cowardice in disguise. But black, femme, and queer folks become the targets for an entire racist subgroup to vent their frustrations because God forbid they take their frustrations out with the 200-pound dreadie that just pancaked them in a mosh pit. No, the cutie patootie with 2006 raw energy and a shit ton of bees is going to get harassed because Brady doesn't have the balls to confront Jamal.
To understand why black people in alternative spaces are still treated as anomalies, we need to go way back. Back before alternative was a genre, before it was an aesthetic, before it was something that people thought of as white at all. Before alternative had a name or could be bought as an aesthetic at Hot Topic, black artists were already pushing sound, performance, and identity so far outside of what was culturally acceptable at the time. In the 1920s and 30s, black musicians were being framed as dangerous for the ideas that they expressed and the way they expressed them. And one such musician of the time was Robert Johnson. And if you don't recognize his name, there is a pretty big chance that you recognize the myth tied to this man. And a huge part of his legacy isn't even about the music. Robert Johnson was born in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, and grew up between Memphis and the Mississippi Delta. By the early 1930s, he was living as what people called a walking musician. And between 1932 and 1938, he traveled constantly throughout the South and into the Midwest. He used aliases, he moved from town to town, and he largely survived through informal networks, including relationships with women who supported him along the way. Johnson's entire recorded legacy comes from 2 recording sessions, one in San Antonio in 1936 and one in Dallas in 1937. That's it, just 2 sessions, and this man left a huge legacy behind. And these songs became the foundation of blues and rock and roll. Some of his most popular and influential songs include Sweet Home Chicago, Crossroad Blues, and Hellhound on My Trail. Even though Johnson was well educated and an amazingly skilled musician, his technical mastery of the guitar was often overshadowed by the supernatural and myths. That Robert Johnson wasn't just talented, he was unnatural. The story goes that he exchanged his soul to the devil in exchange for his ability to play. And supposedly he had 7 years left on Earth as part of this pact. On the surface, that myth stuck for 2 reasons. One, because his skill felt unsettling to folks, almost unnatural. It was reported by fellow blues musicians that he had magically improved over the course of a year. And the other is that he died at a very young age, at just 27. But if we dig a little deeper and we look at the myth of Robert Johnson in relation to his contributions to American music as a whole and the lack of recognition of black musicians in these spaces, it's more than that. Because it's easier to blame the supernatural than to admit a black man could be that skilled, innovative, and far ahead of his time. Calling his skill a deal with the devil turns his achievement and skill into something suspicious and dangerous instead of something that was just earned. And maybe I'm digging into this a little too deeply, even though I personally don't feel that way. This isn't an unfamiliar thing. Black people and other people of color, their achievements and skill have often been minimized by some random. In this case, it's the supernatural, the devil. Because once it's become decided that this music came from the devil, you don't have to acknowledge this man's skill. Society didn't have to reckon with the fact that this sound reshaped American music almost overnight. But the reality is that Johnson's impact can be felt today. He influenced the likes of Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin, Bob Dylan, Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, and even some of his contemporaries like Muddy Waters and B.B. King. While Robert Johnson's story was consumed by myth, the next person in this timeline was just skipped altogether until recent years. Sister Rosetta Tharpe was a singer, songwriter, and guitarist who was active in the 1930s and 40s. She came out of the gospel music scene and would go on to become the godmother of rock and roll. And if you don't know anything about Sister Rosetta Tharpe, you may be scratching your head, wondering how a gospel artist can have such a huge impact on rock and roll. Well, gospel and rock and roll go hand in hand, specifically when it comes to black churches. And if you don't know who Tharpe is, I am so happy that I can introduce you to this phenomenal black woman. Gospel in the 1930s and 40s was, for the most part, pretty somber. When you think about the sound of gospel music in general, you think about the pianos, the organs, the choir, maybe the tambourine. But then Sister Rosetta Tharpe hits the scene and she hits it like a wrecking ball. Here's a black woman with an electric guitar, an instrument that was decidedly masculine at that time, praising the Lord with showmanship. Because she wasn't just a musician, she was a showwoman. She made gospel music something you could really feel, something you could clap to, jump to, dance to. Sister Rosetta Tharpe walked so that Kirk Franklin could run. She blended blues with electric guitar, an engaging stage presence, and gospel. Tharpe was a musical prodigy. At the young age of 6, she began her musical career as part of a traveling evangelical troupe with her mother. In 1938, she became a hit with songs like Rock Me and That's All. Over the course of her career, she received a lot of criticism from the more traditional conservative gospel acts for performing in environments like nightclubs and concert halls. She was meeting the people where they were at, but on the other side of the coin, she was considered to be too gospel to mainstream artists. And with all this going on, she was a rebel in her own right. This was a lot to contend with. She was already violating the rules before there was a name or language to define this type of cultural rebellion. And she was a big deal during her time. She made a huge impact, but it was a long time before she would receive her flowers.
Surprise, surprise!
She inspired acts like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Johnny Cash. Matter of fact, it was Tharpe who put Little Richard on the stage for the first time when he was just 14 years old. During her European tour in 1964, she had a profound impact on the musicians who would go on to lead the British invasion, like Keith Richards, Jimmy Page, and Eric Clapton. And as impactful as she was, you would think that she would get the recognition that she deserved. But no, she was written out of rock and roll history for decades. When she passed away in 1973, she was laid to rest in an unmarked grave for 35 years. And it wasn't until her fans raised the funds to get a headstone that she would receive one in around 2008. In 2007, she was inducted into the Blues Hall of Fame and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2018. It is just insane that it took this long for her to receive her flowers, and of course, it was after her passing. Robert Johnson and Sister Rosetta Tharpe were not the only black musical acts that laid the foundation for unconventional and non-conformist music and presentation. Lead Belly, Gladys Bentley, and Josephine Baker, just to name a few, were also trailblazers during this period. By the 1940s through the 1960s, the American music scene was doing two things at the same time. On the one hand, there was cultural innovation happening in music. New sounds, louder instruments, more attitude, and more rebellion against the status quo. But on the other hand, there was a machine behind the scenes that was working to repackage that aesthetic and sell it to white audiences. That rock and roll sound that today people think of as rebellious and all-American wasn't something that came out of nowhere. It came from black musical traditions rooted in gospel and blues, especially Delta blues, which originated in the Mississippi Delta. But once the music industry realized that there was money to be made, that same sound got sanitized, renamed, and was systematically repackaged and marketed by the white-dominated music industry as a safe but rebellious genre for white teenagers. So while the civil rights movement was pushing the country forward, the music industry was taking black innovation and stripping it of its soul and then reselling it with a different face. Rock and roll's foundation is usually credited to the post-war electrified blues of artists like Muddy Waters. Born in Mississippi and affiliated with the Chicago club scene, Waters' sound was loud, rhythmic, and unapologetic, and it directly inspired an entire generation of musicians who would go on to define rock music. But while his influence spread everywhere, his access to the mainstream didn't. Most pop radio at the time was white-owned, and black artists like Waters were largely confined to segregated stations and race charts. You heard right. I said
Race charts.
that was an actual thing. And that segregation didn't just take place on the radio. It also happened on the road for black artists. Black performers performed on what was known as the Chitlin Circuit, a network of venues, clubs, and theaters that were safe for black performers during Jim Crow. Because traveling, especially in the South as a black artist or musician, wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. And I've talked about the Green Book in a past video. If you haven't checked it out, I will include it here. It was so dangerous for black travelers that this book, the Green Book, had to be created to help black travelers have safe passage, and it would direct them to safer accommodations, whether it was places to stay, places to eat, fun places to visit for the family. So black artists had to build their own touring infrastructure. From the 1920s through the early 1950s, record labels and trade magazines used race records to categorize music made by black artists for black audiences. Blues, gospel, jazz, and early R&B, all of it got shoved into a separate lane. And radio stations followed suit, playing these records on segregated stations or during specific time slots, while mainstream pop radio stayed almost entirely white. So when black artists sold records or built an audience, it didn't mean they were crossing over. It just meant that they were successful within a box that had already been decided for them. The term race records was phased out eventually in 1949, and then it was changed to rhythm and blues. And this was when this genre of music became popular to white audiences. And when that music started to break out of the segregated lane that it was forced into, the industry had a backup plan: white cover versions. Little Richard's 1955 hit Tutti Frutti is a perfect example of this. His original performance of the song was loud and innovative for the time, but within months, Pat Boone released a whitewashed, toned-down version that got far more pop radio play and promotion. Boone's version reached number 12 on the US Billboard pop charts, while Little Richard's landed at 17, but number 2 on the R&B charts. And even though Pat Boone's rendition is considered to be inferior compared to Little Richard's, he sold more records due to the radio play and the promotion he got. And this wasn't a one-off situation. It was a standard practice. White artists covering black songs were considered to be far more safer, more marketable versions. Now, of course, we cannot talk about this topic without touching on the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. Elvis openly covered black artists like Little Richard, Arthur Crudup, Big Mama Thornton, Chuck Berry, and Ray Charles. His early fame was actually built on these covers and songs that were given to him, and he publicly acknowledged and even credited his influences from black artists. And in the 1950s, at the height of segregation, Elvis Presley became the perfect solution for the industry. He had the energy, he had the voice, he had the sex appeal, the sense of danger, that feeling that parents get when they don't want their young, sweet daughter being in love with the bad boy in the black jean jacket, whatever you know what I'm saying? He had that whole thing going on for him. But he also had something that the black artists he was copying didn't have. He was white, and that made him safe. That made him marketable, acceptable for mainstream radio and television. He could sell the feeling of rebellion without actually threatening racial division. And I want to go back to Little Richard for just a moment before I move on, because he definitely deserves more than a footnote in this video. He was a trailblazer in so many ways. He was flamboyant, he wore makeup, he screamed, and he bent gender expectations in ways that made people uncomfortable. And just imagine that in the 1950s. If that is not rebellion and giving a big you to society, I don't know what is. And it doesn't stop at Little Richard. Before him, there was Escarita. Escarita was an openly queer, high energy black pianist who directly influenced influenced Little Richard's style, but was largely ignored by the industry altogether. And that kind of gender nonconformity wasn't just about aesthetics. These same traits and forms of rebellion against the status quo later became hallmarks of punk, goth, glam, and other alt subcultures. So by the late 1940s to early 1950s, white kids were buying R&B records, and black kids were listening to pop and country. And that's not because of some grand political statement. It was simply because the music was a bop. The kids liked it. Record labels and radio stations saw what kids were already doing and adjusted. Stations like WDIA in Memphis started playing music across lines that weren't supposed to be crossed. And listening to rock and roll didn't turn someone into a civil rights activist or anything like that, but it did something that quietly operated in the background, at least at first. It made racial boundaries feel less fixed. If you could relate to the same song, the same dance to the same record, and feel the same feels, it got harder to believe that those racial lines were rooted in reality. And all of this was happening at the same time the civil rights movement was becoming harder to ignore. So even when music wasn't trying to be political, it was being treated that way. Just listening felt like a statement. Songs like School Days by Chuck Berry worked because they didn't talk about race at all. They talked about normal, relatable shit. Schools, parents, boredom, wanting freedom as a kid, as a teenage youth, stuff black and white teenagers were dealing with. And when white parents found out their kids were listening to rock and roll, they were clutching their pearls, especially in the South, of course, because if their children could share the same musical taste as black children, well, what's gonna prevent them from sharing the same spaces, from drinking from the same water fountains? In the South, rock and roll was seen as part of a broader threat to the Southern way of life. But this panic amongst white parents was not only happening in the South. In the North, especially in newly built suburbs meant to avoid integration, parents watched their kids embrace black music and saw it as a betrayal, also clutching their invisible pearls. Rock and roll only became rebellious because white parents were scared of what the music represented. Their kids listening to black music was seen as dangerous, inappropriate, and even threatening, and doing it anyway became a form of resistance, whether it was intentional or not. And that mindset is what alt culture grew out of. But the gag is, fast forward just a few years later, and black people are being accused of being performative or not belonging in modern alt spaces, the same space that couldn't exist without them. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, that same black American sound made its way across the pond and would influence what would be known as the British invasion. Bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were openly enthralled by black American musicians. I already mentioned that Sister Rosetta Tharpe was very influential to many of these artists across the pond, but there was also Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters, and Bo Diddley. They also had a very big impact on British musicians. But Little Richard played a huge role, not only in influence, but also in the formation of some of these acts. The Beatles were covering Little Richard's songs in their early sets, and they opened for him during their residency in Hamburg. They studied his vocals, his piano playing style, and his stage presence. That screaming, over-the-top energy that people associate with early rock, that came from Little Richard. And the Beatles showed him genuine appreciation, including many other black artists they were influenced by. This was appreciation, not theft, not appropriation, which was rare those days. But while the Beatles took the lessons Little Richard gave them globally, the master himself faced a different reality. Back in America, black artists like Little Richard were being confined in their little boxes of segregation. So when that black American sound was filtered through white British bands, repackaged, and sent back to the US, it arrived as something, yet again, more palatable and exciting. And just to be clear, this doesn't stop in the 1960s. Black artists continue shaping punk, post-punk, metal, industrial, goth, grunge, all of it, baby, all of it. By the time you get to the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, the impact of all of this starts showing up in a very specific way. Enter the weird black kid era. Now, I can't speak for everyone's experiences growing up during this time who was black and alternative. I can only speak on what I've witnessed, stories I've heard from friends, and the repeated stories of complete strangers. Rock, metal, anime, goth fashion, anything outside of what had already been boxed in as black came with a label, whether that was acting white or trying too hard or not really black. Those lines had already been drawn decades earlier by white music and marketing execs who decided what blackness was supposed to sound like and look like. So stepping outside of that was considered to be weird. And then stepping into alternative spaces was oftentimes worse. There was still that same passive and sometimes very direct hostility, that same sense of not being fully welcome. And once you know this history, the long lineage of black influence in these spaces, it becomes blatantly absurd that black people are still being asked to prove their validity. So if you like this video, go ahead and hit the like button, and why not subscribe to the channel and share it with a friend, or better yet, share it with someone who you know for a fact needs a history lesson on this topic.